Let's turn our Bibles to 1 Kings chapter 16. 1 Kings chapter 16. So as we likely conclude our time here at Discovery Middle School over the next 4 or 5 weeks, prayerfully, today we begin a 4-part series on the prophet Elijah. And many consider Elijah as the GOAT of all prophets in Israel, the greatest of all time. Elijah. So if there's a Mount Rushmore of the Bible, I would say Elijah's on it. In terms of his legacy, we find Elijah's name more than 100 times in the Bible, including 29 times in the New Testament. The name Elijah is the mission of his life. Elijah means, my God is Yahweh. When Jesus goes to the Mount of Transfiguration, who's there with him? It's Moses and Elijah. Moses and Elijah join Jesus, and it's symbolic because Moses gave the law, Elijah called the people back to the law, and Jesus fulfills the law. When Jesus cried out on the cross, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, some actually thought he was calling on Elijah to save him. Elijah is the forerunner to John the Baptist, the man that Jesus called the greatest. Hundreds of years before John the Baptist, Elijah made it fashionable, or not so much, to dress like a wild man. All right, he changed his culture and challenged it around him. He challenged the powerful and the corrupt. He risked his life to destroy idolatry in Israel. And get this, no small thing on Elijah's resume, Elijah never died. God just took him away in a chariot of fire. As they say, Elijah was walking one day with a friend, and you know he was taken, and there you go. Elijah never died. Now, he wanted to die, but that's another story for another time. Elijah was a spiritual giant, and yet James 5:17 tells us he is a human being just like us. So as we study Elijah, I want us to keep this in mind and not lose sight of our focus here. As great as Elijah was and is, Yahweh is always the hero of the story, not this prophet. So if you want a title for today, Elijah Part 1, this is it. Above all, trust in God. Above all else, trust in God. Let's pick up reading now in 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 29. And this here in 1 Kings 16:29, this will give us an idea of the horrible spiritual condition of God's people during the days of Elijah. 1 Kings 16, verse 29. In the 38th year of King Asa of Judah, Ahab, son of Omri, became king of Israel. And he reigned in Samaria over Israel 22 years. Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. He not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, but he also married Jezebel, daughter of Ithbaal, king of the Sidonians. It's not so small matter if someone, he married Jezebel, right? And so he married Jezebel and began to serve Baal and worship him. Verse 32, he set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal that he built in Samaria. Ahab also made an Asherah pole, and he did more to arouse the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than did all the kings of Israel before him. So here we go. It's the infamous King Ahab and his pagan wife, Jezebel. These are not popular names for children these days, and for good reason. It says here, Ahab did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any king before him. It's important to understand why. Because Ahab married outside of the kingdom, the false god Baal is now given official status and worship in Israel. So this begs the question, and this is important as we go through our study of Elijah over the next few weeks. Who or what is Baal? Baal is the lord of the Canaanite religion. Baal is the god of the storms. And when I say God in terms of Baal, I'm using a lowercase g. Baal is the god of the storms. And for the Canaanites, they believed Baal provided for them rain, fertility, and that Baal had the power of life and death. And then you have Asherah, is the alleged fertility goddess and the mother of Baal. So both of these gods had a large company of prophets and priests for their pagan worship. Now, here's what's tricky about what's happening during the time of Elijah. God's people still worship Yahweh, but now they also officially worship Baal and Asherah. And these were the gods of prosperity, the gods of personal comfort and sex. Does this sound familiar? They worship both. They had it both ways. So this begs the question as well, who's going to tell them? Who's going to speak up? Who's going to stand up for Yahweh? Let's read chapter 17, verse 1. Now Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe and Gilead said to Ahab, "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except for my word." So God calls Elijah to confront the king of Israel face to face. So at the risk of his life, Elijah obeys God. And we'll learn later in chapter, I'm going to give you clean, pure, filtered water from a dirty stream. And this is the first example in our text today that Yahweh controls life and death, not Baal. Not any other God that we could worship today. God controls life and death. But do you trust him? Especially in the worst of circumstances, we must trust God, not the false gods of this world. But God's not finished flexing his muscles. Not by a long shot. The narrative gets crazier. 1 Kings 17, verse 7. Sometime later, the brook dried up. Of course, because there had been no rain in the land. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, "Go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon, and you stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food." Now, this is ridiculous. This is scandalous, and here's why. Well, obviously, the brook has dried up. Raven's restaurant has been closed down. It's closed its doors. So the Lord commands Elijah to move to a new place. But this is not just any city. God tells his man to go and live in Zarephath. And this is the heartland of Baal worship. This is not a safe place for Elijah. Go and live in Sidon among the Gentiles. Go live in the home country of Jezebel. That's where her people are. That's where she's from. Think about what Elijah could be thinking in his mind. But God, I'm a marked man. This is Jezebel's hood. This is not safe. How will I eat? This makes no sense. But here's what God tells Elijah in verse 9. You go to the region of Sidon. I have it all set up for you. And get this. I've arranged for a Gentile widow to meet your needs. And this is bonkers. This is outrageous. This is not a safe plan. Jewish prophets are not exactly welcome in this part of the world. These are not safe people for Elijah. In the Sidon region, I can imagine there are posters hanging everywhere that says Elijah wanted, dead or alive. Gentiles and Jews are enemies, and Jewish men never hang out with Gentile women. And this begs the question as well, why did God choose this woman to provide for Israel's prophet? Why? And I think we have to really contemplate that, and I hope you do that. I hope you marinate on this in your small groups in the week or two to come, because Jesus highlighted this in his first sermon. I mean, he brought it out. This is scandalous, and centuries had passed, but when Jesus brought it up and used it as a preaching point in his first sermon in his hometown, the audience wanted to kill him for preaching about it. But if it's important to Jesus, it must be important to us. He's teaching us something about faith and trust in God. But here's the point. Elijah completely trusted Yahweh. Let's keep reading in verse 10. So, Elijah went to Zarephath. And I'll just stop there for a minute. Obedience. Obedience. Sometimes you and I just need to get up and obey the Lord. You may not understand it. It may hurt you. You may not feel like it. You may be tired. If you're anything like me, you may be feeling that day lethargic or even depressed, but you know what you need to do. Just do the next right thing. Obey the Lord. Sometimes that's all you can do. I don't understand, but the next right thing for me to do is to obey the Lord. Verse 10, so Elijah went to Zarephath. And when he came to the town gate, a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and asked, "Would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink?" And as she was going to get it, he called, and by the way, bring me, please, a piece of bread. "As surely as the Lord your God lives," she replied, "I don't have any bread. Only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I'm gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son that we may eat it and die." Tough times. Verse 13, Elijah said to her, "Don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said. But first, make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me. Then make something for yourself and your son." Wow. If you're a parent, wow. This is a big ask of a mama bear. I mean, I learned early on in my marriage, never take food off your wife's plate. Not even that. Don't even stare at her plate. You just take a quick glance and look away, like the sun, you don't want to look at it too long. How could Elijah have the confidence to make such a bold request? Here it is. Verse 14. How does he do this? Well, verse 14, "For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, said." He's living by the word of God. He trusts God. "The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on this land." She went away and did as Elijah had told her. So there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family. For the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken to Elijah. What we just read, this example number 2, that Yahweh controls life and death, not Baal. And I picture Elijah walking into Zarephath, and I just laugh. It's ridiculous. Here comes this crazy man and his get-up, and who knows what he's wearing, being out in the woods and being fed by ravens and drinking from a brook, and he's wild anyway, and he's wearing a savage hair suit, leather belt, walks right into a hostile neighborhood. And as far as we know, everyone's thinking it's Elijah's fault that there's a famine in the land. Here's the guy. But not only that, he immediately sees a woman at the gate and says, hey, could I please get a Stanley bottle over here? I'm thirsty. I need some water. And then she agreed. Oh, and by the way, while you're at it, bring me some Hawaiian sweet rolls too. Oblivious to the famine. But as it turns out, and we know this, the Gentile widow is in a very desperate situation. She has no reason to trust this intimidating man or trust the God that he serves. And before she runs into this wild and smelly prophet, she thinks this is going to be the last meal for her and her boy. They will soon starve to death. And in verse 13, Elijah's instructions to this woman he just met defy the natural instincts of a mother. But just like God did with him, Elijah calls this widow to completely trust him. This is a calling for all of us. This is a calling we see here to have this supernatural, risky faith in the one and only living God. And Elijah tells her in verse 13, don't be afraid. You go do as you plan, but start with me. Make a small cake for me, bring it to me, then make something for yourself and for your son. Mama bears, could you even imagine this request being made of you? Feed the prophet first, then feed your starving child. I'm telling you, Hallmark would never make this as a Mother's Day card. But this is how faith responds to the word of God. Verse 15, she went and did as Elijah told her, and there was always enough food for Elijah and for her family. The jar of flour was never empty, the jug of oil never ran out, just as the Lord had promised through Elijah. Jesus is on the throne, not our children. Easier said than done. What if we feel like our children are not safe? This is not a good physical situation, emotional, spiritual. We may never, parents, have to make the same decision this widow did, but as parents, we're daily faced with the little decisions of putting God's kingdom first above our family every single day. And if I take a radical stand, wow, what's that mean? We can get very insecure. We can live in fear. Well, maybe my child will run away from God, run away from the church, or even run away from me. These are very real fears. The Word of God says, don't be afraid. Trust in God. And we clearly see what happens here when the widow chooses to trust the prophet and to trust in a God she barely knew. Verses 15 and 16, there was food every day. God took care of Elijah. God took care of this woman, her son. It was in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken to Elijah. When it comes to our family, when it comes to our closest relationships, we must trust in God, not the false gods of this world. But God is not done growing the faith of this woman or the faith of Elijah. Let's read on in verse 17. 1 Kings 17, verse 17. Sometime later, the son of the woman who owned the house became ill. The son grew worse and worse, and finally he stopped breathing. She said to Elijah, "What do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" Watch out, Mama Bear. And we can all go there. Someone here is feeling judged right now. When hard times come, that's when we can get weird. Guilt sets in. We know we've messed up. We know we have sin. We know we're sinners, but we push back on it towards other people. Right here, she gets defensive. Hey, I have sin issues, yes, but why kill my son for it? I'm a widow. I've been through lots of pain. If you loved me, you'd be protecting me, not judging me. Of course, all these fears turn out to be phantoms. This is a severe test of faith. This woman has no control here. And that's the very thing we often try to seize in our fear. But she has no control. Elijah is not in control. It's no use to blame him. Ahab and Jezebel, they tried to control things. They don't rule the nations. Baal has no sovereignty over the harvest. In fact, Baal never even existed. Only the living God has the power of life and death. And for parents, many times the crucible of our faith is our children. So the top left there, that's my son Nate and me before we dropped him off on his first day of preschool. 4 years old. And then the other pictures are what happened 3 days ago. We dropped off Nate for college. And this time we're not picking him up after school. And we've all cried about it. It's bittersweet. And we're so proud of him. And despite my sin, my mistakes along the way, my dysfunction that I'm battling, I really feel we did the best we could, and now we must let him go. Got to let him go. He's in God's hands. He really always has been in God's hands. But now it's very much a reality. We must learn to trust God in even greater ways. And back to our text, this is a severe test of trust in God for both the prophet and the boy's mother. The boy is dying. And all they can do at this point is cry out to the only one that controls life and death. Let's keep reading in verse 19. "Give me your son," Elijah replied. And he took him from her arms and carried him to the upper room where he was staying and laid him on his bed. Then he cried out to the Lord, "Lord, my God, have you brought tragedy even on this widow I'm staying with by causing her son to die?" Then he stretched himself out on the boy 3 times, and he cried out to the Lord, "Lord, my God, let this boy's life return to him." It's desperation time. Have you ever felt this way about someone you love? Have you ever experienced this with someone close to you? I know for me it's been 23 years, but I still visualize the paramedics coming into my parents' house after my dad's heart attack. And doing everything they could to revive him. And I'm powerless at that moment as I see this happen. There's nothing I can do. No amount of education, no amount of good deeds, no amount of friends. I'm powerless. I'm sobbing. I'm praying to God. That's the one thing I could do over and over again. I'm praying to God because God holds the power of life and death. And I know God can revive my dad. But the question is this God's will for him to revive my dad? God said, "Not this time. Not this time, son. Just trust me on this. I got you." 13 years ago, Amy and I, we prayed for the life of Amy's mom when she had cancer. And God gently told us Not this time. I know it hurts, and you don't understand. Just please trust me. I'll take care of you, and I'm going to take care of her. That's what's the context. That's what's happening here with Elijah and the mother of this young boy. Let's keep reading in verse 22. The Lord heard Elijah's cry. The Lord heard it. And the boy's life returned to him, and he lived. Elijah picked up the child, carried him down from the room into the house. He gave him to his mother and said, "Look, your son is alive." Then the woman said to Elijah, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth." And I love this story because it shows the true heart of God, the mercy of God, the compassion of God. And I think when people have been around a long time and been known as God's people, like the Israelites, you tend to lose trust in God. You get seduced by other gods. You embrace other gods, and you have a lukewarm relationship with Yahweh. It's there, but it's not what it used to be, and you're trusting in other things and other people. And sometimes, as we see in this story, and this is significant, and I think this is part of Jesus' point when he preached this in his first sermon, God many times will choose an unlikely outsider, like this Gentile widow, this underdog. God will use this unlikely outsider to receive his supernatural blessings, to show what it means to trust in him. And this is what it does for me, and I think what it does for the Israelites. It can call us old-timers back to their first love. It calls us back to completely trust in God, because we lose our way. But when we put God first, when we put God above our emotional wants and needs, when we break down all these walls of control that we've set up to protect ourselves and protect our families, our Father will always take care of our basic needs. And then and only then can our faith truly grow, when we stop controlling everything and seeking out the false gods that don't even exist. Trust in God. The woman said to Elijah in verse 24, "Now I know you are a prophet and that the Lord really does speak through you." This is the third concrete example that Yahweh controls life and death, not Baal. So to conclude part one here of Elijah, Elijah was a human being, just like us. And yet God worked in amazing ways in his life. Why? Because he completely trusted in Yahweh. And to that I say, why not us? Why not now? Our God, he is alive. But do you completely trust him? And I appeal to you, I warn you, do not trust the false gods of our world today. The God of politics, the God of political parties, the God of American nationalism, the God of comfort, the God of selfishness, the God of living your truth, the God of sexual freedom. These gods do not control life or death. These gods are an illusion. These gods are dead. But our God, the God of Elijah, our God, he is alive. So I'm going to ask us now to stand and sing as our singers take the stage. Next week, we're going to pick up right where we left off here in 1 Kings chapter 18. And you can see, if you keep reading, the tension is building in Israel. All of this is leading to this remarkable showdown of faith between the God of Israel and the false gods of this world. How long will God's people waver between two opinions? Our God, He is alive. Let's stand and sing.